Michael Fallon speaking to me a little bit earlier. What, if anything, then, did the attacks in Brussels tell us about our own security? And does it make any clearer the answer to that inevitable question, whether Britain is safer or more exposed within the parameters of the EU? Joining us now, Dan Hannan, MEP and author of Why Vote Leave, a book which is out tomorrow, and Charlie Faulkner, Lord Faulkner, the Shadow Justice Secretary, who backs the government to remain. And welcome to you both. Very nice to have you here. Perhaps more than anything else, Dan Hannan, this idea of Theresa May, Home Secretary, who kept us all guessing for a long time about which way she'd go, who knows more than anyone the frustrations of dealing with EU institutions, has said today, loud and clear, that it will make us more safe if we remain in the EU.
Well, I was never guessing. It was always very clear which way Theresa was going to go. I've never, ever heard her voice a view other than that we should stay in the EU, and that's a perfectly honourable position. There are good, patriotic people on both sides of this. Equally, the former head of our secret intelligence services, Sir Richard Dearlove, has just come out and said we will be safer if we leave the EU, and it's very important to look at why he says that. He says, first of all, we'll have the power to deport villains who are dangerous, and second, because we'll be outside elements of the immigration rules, which will mean that we have more control over who is coming in and leaving. And it must be right that we are safer if we are in control of our own affairs.
And this is the Boris Johnson argument as well, that actually if you can control what the ECJ does or what we do in terms of who we deport and send home, you've got control.
Yeah, and it's rubbish. Because the reason, for example, that we can't deport people is nothing to do with the European Union. It's the European Convention on Human Rights that prevents that. So Richard Dearlove, who uses that as his main argument, is completely wrong.
What about Abu Hamza's daughter-in-law? That was the European Union. That was the European Union.
And the reason why the European Union said you couldn't deport was because of the European Convention on Human Rights.
No, it was because of free movement as EU citizens. The European Convention is a whole extra argument.
You're wrong. As far as the point about why we're safer in Europe, it's because we have signed up to a specific number of European Union instruments which allow us to go into European Union databases on fingerprints within 24 hours, number plates within 5 minutes or 15 minutes, and DNA within 15 minutes. And having that information when people present themselves at your borders or when you get DNA from a scene is a really vital piece of evidence.
Let's break
that
some
is
of those
why,
down.
if you're looking at terrorists who are crossing borders, to go out of the European Union, you will have to leave these arrangements. It's not about intelligence sharing, it's about specific deals that we've done. And anybody who says we are safer outside those arrangements is talking absolute rubbish.
The fingerprint, for example, comes under this odd word, PRUM, which we are meant to be signing up to, which would make a 143-day wait for fingerprinting happen in 15 minutes.
Yes.
It's hard to reject that, isn't it?
First point, the alternative to the EU running elements of criminal justice is not that we don't talk to any of our immediate allies, right? For a long time before the EU came along, there was the Hague Convention, there was Interpol, there were extradition deals, there was recognition of time spent in another country's prison as part of your sentence. All of that existed and will continue to exist as it does with non-EU countries. Our intelligence sharing will carry on with our friends in Europe as it does with Canada and Australia and so on. Well,
it must move
we would have the choice on issues like PRUM, on issues like the European arrest warrant. You know, Iceland this month is debating whether to join the European arrest warrant. That's the choice for a post-EU democratic Britain. Do we stay in it or do we not? Personally, I hope we don't, because I think we pay a high price in terms of democracy.
And we've rejected the ones we don't.
Correct.
Why can't we carry on doing that?
That's what we should do, exactly. In the European Union, what Daniel is saying, as I understand it, we withdraw and then try to renegotiate all these, which might take 7 years. He's talking rubbish. He says we could just go straight back into, for example, extradition arrangements. He will know that in 1995, a terrorist fled from Paris, came to Britain in 1995, and was extradited under the pre-European arrest warrant arrangements 7 years later, after the attempted bombings a week after 7/7, Hussein Osman, one of the terrorists, was extradited after 2 weeks from Italy.
And let me ask you, do you think he would not have been extradited? This is someone, Hussein Osman, who was caught on camera running out of the tube station with the smoke billowing around him. You're telling me the Italians would not have extradited that man without the European arrest warrant?
I am telling you that, yes, and I can tell you that before the European arrest warrant, extraditions from Italy took years.
Well,
and I know that because I was the Secretary of State for Justice at the time.
Let me tell you the practical
So
reality of the European arrest warrant. Okay, a constituent of mine who you may have heard of called Asher King, a little boy who was taken out of Southampton University to seek treatment. His parents were detained by this awesome instrument that we were told was supposed to be an anti-terrorist measure. When you put that kind of power in the hands of the authorities, as in his case, you use it routinely. If you are telling me that the European arrest warrant...
So you're against it?
Yes, I am. And, and I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
I was
So
in
just to clarify, does that mean you would not want us outside the EU to rejoin the European arrest warrant?
That would be a matter for the Democratic Parliament of the UK to decide.
And what do you think that would mean?
But I would not.
I think it would obviously mean that we couldn't extradite terrorists in weeks. It would mean that terrorists, once they managed to get outside Britain, would take years to be got back.
But what do they do now? What do countries who don't have the European arrest warrant do when there is a very clear case of sending a criminal?
It takes years.
Well, I had a...
Isn't that right? Isn't that right, Daniel?
I had a constituency
Isn't that right,
case.
Daniel?
Yeah, well, allow me to answer. Andrew
It's a
Symeou,
yes or no.
a boy who was celebrating his A-levels in Greece, spent 2 years on an obviously false charge. It was an obvious case of mistaken identity. 11 months in one of the nastiest prisons in Europe, waiting for his case to come to trial. By the time he was finally cleared, as he was obviously going to be right from the start, the guys with whom he had been celebrating his A-levels had graduated. Now, how do you give that back to a boy of that age? That's the reality of allowing British citizens to be sucked out of the country under this mechanism.
But aren't you creating more of a bureaucratic nightmare every time you pull out of a system and then half the time you want to readmit yourself and half the time you don't? The bureaucracy is unending.
But it's the bureaucracy that's in charge of the mess that we see
that's
around
not
us.
go away,
The
is
former
it?
head of Interpol,
No,
Ronnie Noble, says that the result of the EU control of this border thing, he says, is like hanging a welcome sign over Europe for terrorists. That's the outgoing head of Interpol. That's
So
Bernard
back
Hogan
to this whole idea of security.
Sorry, yeah.
Do you think that we are less secure out of the EU? Actually less secure out of the EU?
Without doubt, we would be less secure because terrorists are crossing borders to try to attack very many of the European countries. We need to cooperate.
But our borders aren't going to change.
Our borders aren't going to change, but because we're in the European Union, we can enter into these arrangements where there are data sharing arrangements. And what Daniel is saying is, let's get out of them.
We agreed to open our borders to the rest of the EU. It is now clear that the EU has opened its borders pretty much to the entire world. Now, that was not the original deal, and I fail to see how it makes us any safer.
And we do not have open borders with the European Union.
But we can't deport
people. Let me finish. As a result of not having open borders, but having joined in the Schengen information sharing arrangements, we get full information about the people who are trying to get into our borders.
Will eventually get residence papers and will have the right to move to the UK, whatever the security implications.
On the back of a rather explicit text from one of your Labour colleagues, what about this Labour list then? I know you're a peer. You don't appear on it, but tell us, give us a sense. Are you core? Are you core plus? Are you neutral? Are you possibly hostile?
Well,
what do you make of it?
I would watch Prime Minister's questions today, and Mr. Ian Duncan-Smith had said that the Prime Minister's economic policy was a total sham. Yet, Mr. Cameron responded by referring to this silly list. He was able to distract attention from his own failure as a Prime Minister.
As you've just done in failing to answer the question.
Isn't that missing an open goal with a clear shot, isn't it, for
No, it's
Jeremy
not.
Corbyn?
Well, all that the Leader of the Opposition can do is ask the questions. If every answer that the Prime Minister comes back with is, what about this list, then you see a Prime Minister wriggling by referring to something as trivial as that.
Thank you both very much. Thanks for coming in. So this week, it is Belgium's tragedy. Last week, it was Turkey. It's becoming increasingly clear this kind of